Today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Menbet. This week of learning is sponsored by Robert Cohen in memory of his mother, my grandmother, Helen Cohen, Hannah Bat Yitzchak Nechemia Zichronah Livracha. And this week is also sponsored for Fuash Lema for Pesha Etzel Bat Sarah. Okay, we are going to start at the very bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Bet. What we saw was when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Israel, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan about these shalosh lishonot shamati. Right, I learned about three. There were three different red strips of wool. And each of these processes, you need a red strip of wool. But I learned that one is 10 zuz, mishkal 10 zuz. The weight of it is the weight of 10 zuzim, 10 coins. One is 2 slaim, which is 8 zuz, so 10 zuz, 8 zuz, and echad mishkal shekel. One is only 2 zuz. Okay, so now we have not, and what did he say? Ainli lefaresh. I don't know which is which. So now we're going to see three different possibilities. Ki ata Ravin, Pirsham Mishmei de Rabbi Yonatan. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yonatan the following. Shel para, right? These are, again, Rav Dimi and Ravin were people who brought the Torah from Israel to Babylonia. Shel para mishkal 10 zuz, v'shel seira mishtalech mishkal 2 slaim, v'shel mitzora mishkal shekel. Okay, and this is what we saw in Atakonanta in the Tefillah. Oh, I wanted to point out one thing. What I researched after class, I mentioned about this Atakonanta and how the Rosh says that Atakonanta, the Nusach, right, talks about how the strip of wool, right? It said it went against what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah said, right, the explanation of the Gemara was that you must tie the Lashon of Zeolit on Atakonanta. What happened was I read the Rosh, but I didn't read Atakonanta till class. And then I opened Atakonanta and it said something not what the Rosh said. So by the way, as I looked, it seems that what must have happened is the Rosh had a certain version of Atakonanta, and the version that we have is not the same version, which makes sense, by the way. There's many piyutim of Atakonanta out there, different nuschaot. He had a version that had it different than the one actually in front that we have in front of us. So I just wanted to get back to that because I was confused the other day when I read it because the Rosh said that, and then I just took out the machzor. I had Atakonanta. I figured I'll read it in class. I hadn't read it beforehand. Like, that's a good example of when you read someone, you can't take it for granted that whatever they said is right. You have to look at it for yourself, because when we looked in Atakonanta, we saw that his version was different than the version that the Rosh had in front of him. So that's just interesting. Anyway, getting back to this issue. So there it had said Shnei Slaim for the Seir Mishtalech. So it goes like this opinion. So now we have, that's the order. The heaviest for the Para Aduma, and that's because we saw, according to one opinion, it needs koved. It needs to be weighed down so that it gets into the pile of burning, the burning para, before it gets burnt itself, before it even lands down on top of the para. The Seir Mishtalech is in between because you need it longer to cut. And the mitzorah, you just need, it could be any really size. Therefore, they used to use a mishkal shekel. But not everybody agrees with this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Pliga bar Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafte v'Rabbanan b'para. There's a machloket specifically about the para. Chad amar mishkal 10, the chad amar mishkal shekel. The two extremes. One said the para needed the heaviest, and one said the para needed the lightest. Uvesimanech, and how do you remember this? Echad amar bev, echad amar it. This is from a famous Mishnah in Menachot. It's a very interesting Mishnah. The Mishnah at the end of Menachot is all about bringing a korban mincha. So the last Mishnah reads, okay, maybe I'll pull it out. It's just interesting to read. I'll pull it off the shelf here. The last Mishnah in Menachot, we're on Kuf Yud of Menachot, says, Ne'emar ba'olat behema isher reach nichach, ube'olat of isher reach nichach, ubemincha isher reach nichach. By a korban ola, these are the voluntary burnt offerings people would bring to the temple all the time. We always talk about olat nedava. It says by behema, by an animal, by a bird, or by a meal offering, the same thing. All of those will be a pleasing fire before God. Which comes to teach you, it doesn't matter if you do more or less. The main thing is what your intent is. Right? It's a way of almost saying, right? We just learned all of Sefer Menachot, and it's all about mincha offerings, which are much less significant than zvachim, which are all about the animal and the bird offerings. The point is, it's all one and the same. If you want to bring your own voluntary offering, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the most expensive, right? It could be just anything. And therefore, right, as long as your intent is in the right place, mincha offerings are just as good as everything else, which is a nice way to end Masechet Minchot. But the point here is, right, you can bring a lot, you can bring a little, it's all the same. And what are they pointing out here? This is how you remember the extremes. The point is that when it comes to the para aduma, there's a machloket about whether it's one extreme position or the other extreme position. It's not like there's just, maybe the middle, maybe right? It's basically at extremes. And that's how you remember it from this Mishnah that talks about extremes. Amalei Rabbi Yirmi Ami Difti Le Ravina. Lo b'para pligi, ela b'se'ira mishtalech pligi. Now the machloket isn't about the para aduma. The machloket is about the se'ira mishtalech. Now this is interesting because we just said the se'ira mishtalech is the middle position. Now we're going to say, oh no, one says the se'ira mishtalech is the heaviest, and one says it's the lightest. Vahu Yoma, and the day that Rabbi Yirmi Midifti said this to Ravina, this is Shiur Mishalech, is this big debate. Is it the heaviest or the lightest? That day was the same day. Hahu Yoma nach nafshei de Rav Bar Kisi. Rav Bar Kisi died that day. The Anchu Basimana, and they placed a siman here. Again, they gave another way to remember this. Rav Bar Kisi mechaper k'se'ira mishtalech. They said that Rav Bar Kisi, his death is going to atone for the community like the Se'ira Mishtalech. It was known that when tzaddikim die, people say this should be a kapara. His death should atone for all the sins of the people. Like now they added this time, instead of just saying his death atoned for the people, they said his death atoned for the people like the Se'ira Mishtalech, like the scapegoat that gets all the sins of the people on it. Now, what does that tell you? It reminds you that the day that he died was this debate about the Se'ira Mishtalech, whether it's the highest, the heaviest, or whether it's the lightest. Okay, that's our conversation. Okay, now we're going to move on to another topic. It's going to be a similar structure where we know there's two things. We just don't know which goes for which. By the way, I was thinking when I was listening to the Parsha, the Shabbat and Shul, it's a little bit disconnected, not connected, but connected to what we've been talking about for a while about the gold and the silver. I couldn't help but get over the amount of gold and silver mentioned in the Nisiim, right? All the Nisiim brought their gifts to the Chanukkah Mishkan, and they brought in these very fancy silver bowls that I was thinking about because of the weight of the money. It's also the way they discussed it in the Torah. The weight is given in the weight of money, and they seem to be very expensive items they were using, and not to mention the amount of sacrifices they brought was a huge amount. It's just interesting in light of what we've been discussing about, on the one hand, Torah chasal mamonan shel Yisrael, and on the other hand, we want things when it comes to the temple to be as glorified as possible. And it's always that pull. This parsha for sure was waiting on the side of, the expensive, fancy utensils that were used, and the gold and the silver that was brought to the temple was a large amount. So anyway, it reminded me of what we're learning. So it's nice when things connect. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. I learned about two different types of slaughterings. Echad shel para ve'echad shel paro. Again, there's a little bit of a play on words here. The para and the paro. The para is the para aduma, the red heifer, and the paro is the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. So one, echad kshera b'zar, ve'echad psula b'zar. There's a difference between the slaughtering of each. One of them can be done by a non-Kohen, and one of them has to be done by a Kohen. But obviously it's going to say like the previous, v'lo yadana heminayu, but I don't know which is which. So now this is going to take us through most of today's daf, which is this machloket Rav and Shmuel. Later we'll see there's some other Amoraim who disagree about the same thing. Itmar, it was said, shchitat para al paro. Rav and Shmuel debate this. We don't know who says what yet. Charamal para psula, paro kshera. The para aduma has to be done by a Kohen. The par of the Kohen Gadol, remember, this is the bull. This is before the goats. We're off the topic of the goats. It seems they brought this because just like this red strip of wool, they didn't know which one goes for which. Likewise, these laws about shchita, one is kshera b'zar, one is psula b'zar, right? Again, a non-Kohen can do one, can't do the other. We don't know which one, but it relates to the par that we discussed previously where the Kohen uses it to confess his own sins and the sins of his family. And in addition, he then does a second confession, which is his own sins, his family's sins, and all the Kohanim's sins. So now it says, so they each say the opposite. To Stayim, now we're going to assume, let's conclude that the Rav Hu de Amar Para Psula. To Stayim is a word that is always used when we don't know who said what. And then we're going to say, we can conclude that this is the person who says the following because of some other statement that he makes. So we're going to start with, okay, Rav. We can assume once we know Rav, we know Shmuel. So Rav says that the para is the one that can't be done by a non-Kohen. Why? Rabbi Zera, first we're going to start with Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, Shlita bepara bizar psula. Sorry, shlitat para bizar psula. The slaughtering of the para aduma can't be done by a non-Kohen. That was Rabbi Zera. Doesn't yet tell us about Rav. But Amar Rav Allah, Rav commented on Rabbi Zera and said, what's the reason why he says this? Elazar v'chuka shaninu ba. It talks about in that section who's supposed to do it, Elazar. And it says the word chukah. Where does it say that? If you remember, para aduma comes up in Parshat Chukat, meaning it starts with the word zot chukat Torah. Okay, and then it says, or where's the pasuk chukah? Zot chukat Torah asher tziva Hashem limor daber al bnei Israel. Okay, take a para aduma. That's pasuk bet. We're in chapter 19 of Bamidbar. The next pasuk says, unitatem ota el Elazar kohen. So let's just read this pasuk literally. We're going to darshan this a bunch of times today, so let's get it straight. Nitatem ota. So you should find a para aduma, it says. Then, and it said chukah. Chukah means it has to be done like this, right? This is, the details are important. They have to be done like the details. So what are the details? Give it to Elazar Kohen. By the way, who was Elazar? The son of Aaron. He wasn't the Kohen Gadol at the time yet. He was the Skana Kohen. He was the next in line to be Kohen. So you give it to Elazar Kohen. Takes the paradum out. Maybe we'll go through the whole process right now. He takes it outside to Har HaZeitim. Remember we had that whole thing. Then he slaughters it. Then, right, b'shachat ota lefanav. We're going to understand what those words mean. Literally, it means, and he slaughters it in front of him. Who's in front of who, right? It's unclear. If he's slaughtering, then who's the in front of? We'll have to talk about this soon. Now, what does he do? He slaughters it. Then he sprinkles the blood. Remember this? He throws it toward the Hechal. He's standing on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives. He faces the Hechal and he sprinkles it. Remember, we had that whole debate about how tall were the walls above the gates and how the height of the floor went up, got higher. And we needed to make sure that he could see from where he was standing, he could see into the Hechal. Because when he sprinkles the blood, he has to see. After he sprinkles the blood, what does he do? He then burns the para right there. It doesn't go on the altar at all. It's not kodshei mizbeach, as we say. It's not things that are sanctified as on the altar. He burns it there. Then he throws into this. We saw this yesterday. He throws into the fire the eitz erez ezov and tolat, right? The cedar wood and the hyssop. And then he put with, right, we saw wrapped around it is this red strip of wool, and he throws that into the fire. It burns. Asaf ish tahor. Ish tahor comes and he gathers the ashes, and then he puts the ashes into water, right? Or he actually, I think, pours the water on top of the ashes into a kli kodesh, where it sanctifies the waters. And then he has the waters, and then he sprinkles, or we're going to see later, anyone really can sprinkle the water on someone who is impure. And that's how they become the purification process. So now we're going to explain. The Rav said, how do we get it? That it has to be Elazar, because it says v'shachat ota, it was talking about Elazar. And the pasuk before said chukah. That means it has to be done like this. Elazar was a Kohen. Therefore, it must be done by a Kohen. So Rav must be the one who thinks the par on Yom Kippur could be done by a zar, which is interesting because we talked about how the Kohen has to do the whole process. Seemingly here, the shechita, not necessarily. And we'll talk about this, how he gets this. But the para aduma has to be slaughtered by the Kohen. So now they say, V'Rav, mashna para dechtiv Elazar v'chuka. If you're going to say it's because it says Elazar and it says chuka, well, also in the parsha of Yom Kippur, it says that similar. Paro nami haktiv Aharon. Remember, Aharon did everything in the desert, right? In the psukim that described it was describing Aharon doing it all. And it says v'chuka. It says they're also chuka. So because chuka is mentioned there, Also, you have to do it exactly as it was done. Should be done by a Kohen. Where, right? Aaron clearly slaughtered it then. So how do you know there? So what is the answer? Shchita lav avodahi. Shchita is not considered avodah. We've talked about this before. There's 4 main avodot. The shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Remember, slaughtering it, accepting the blood, carrying the blood to the altar, and throwing the blood on the altar. However, we always say that shchita stands separately. It's an avoda, but it's not really the same kind of avoda. And how do we know that? Because in general, in all other sacrifices, and that's going to be the whole question, but maybe not here, in all other sacrifices, the shechita can be done by a non-Kohen. So it must not be a major part of the avodah because it's allowed by a non-Kohen. So therefore, he says, when it says chukah by Aharon and Yom Kippur, it's referring to the main avodot of the day, but it's not referring to the shechita. The shechita is not a main avodah. To which the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. Well, let's throw the question then back on the para. If you're saying shechita is not a main avoda, and chukah, when it comes to Yom Kippur, doesn't include shechita, so why is chukah including shechita when it comes to the para aduma? That there it has to be done exactly so. It's not part of the main avoda. So how are you right? Avoda means ritual. It's not a main part of the ritual, not by the par of Kohen Gadol, if then obviously not by para aduma. So what do they say? No, shai para de kodesh kabayiti. Para is in a different category. When we say it's not a main avoda, it's when we're talking about things that go on the altar, because the blood has to go on the altar. That's the main part, but the shechita and maybe burning it, but the shechita is not the main part. But when we're talking about kodesh kabayit, which means anything that's not sanctified by the altar, because it goes on the altar, and the paraduma doesn't go on the altar, it's in a whole different category. Because it's in a different category, you can say that the avodah is that the shechita is maybe a main part. To which the Gemara says, wait, it would be the opposite logic. Vilav kol dekenu, isn't it what we say, kol sheken? All the more so. Now, when we talk about sanctity, Beda Kabayit is always a lower sanctity than Mizbeach. Anything that goes on the altar has a higher level of sanctity. If the shechita of a high level sanctity is not important, then how can you say the shechita of a low level sanctity is important? It doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Shisha Bered Rav Idi, he answers the question, Midi Dahavi Amaro Migaim de Lava Vodi. Now we're moving to a different topic. When it talks about Mitzora, the leprous house, a leprous body, how does it become determined that it's leprosy? Only a Kohen can determine. A non-Kohen can't do that because it says in the Torah, Kohen, Kohen, Kohen throughout the whole section. The Kohen has to be the one who declares it a leper. Now, is that an avodah to look at a nega, a leprous mark, and say this is leprosy? That's not a ritual. Once we leave the temple, anything that goes on the altar, then we have rules. Shchita is not avodah. Zrikatam and some other things are avodah. But when you leave the temple and you're already talking about something different, like marot negaim, for example, which have nothing to do with avodah in the temple, so calling a nega might sound not so important, but it's important enough that Torah says it has to be done by a Kohen. Likewise, by the paraduma, since there aren't main rituals, certainly not that go on the altar, therefore the shechita must be central, and that's what the Torah is telling us. Elazar has to do this, and it's a chukah, it's a rule, and it's a rule that you can't break. And therefore it's not a matter of higher level, lower level. It's a matter of that since we're outside the temple, there's different definitions and different criteria. And we don't say, oh, shechita is not important anymore. No, shechita might be more of a central activity because there isn't as much of a central activity like, let's say, the sprinkling of the blood, which kind of takes over everything, and that becomes much more significant. So because of that, they just say it's a different track. And therefore, you could say, that's why Rav says, shechita there, it says Elazar chukah, only Elazar. By Yom Kippur, when it says Aharon and chukah, they're talking about the central parts. This is not as central. The slaughtering is not as important. So therefore, right, just like marot negaim, it's lav avodah, and yet by a kahuna, and it needs a kohen. Likewise, by paraduma, you could say it needs a kohen. So that's rough. Now we have to explain Shmuel. Ula Shmuel, because he says the exact opposite. Paraduma doesn't need Elazar, it doesn't need the kohen, and par of Yom Kippur does. So the Shmuel, we're going to assume, where does he get it from? Well, the Shmuel, Damar paro psula, maishna paro dichtiv aharon v'chuka, para nami haktiv Elazar v'chuka. They don't even bring his reason. They just said, we obviously assume that you must learn it from what we just said in the name of Rav, you can't learn, which is Aharon and Chukah. Now, if it's because of Aharon and Chukah that you say it has to be done exactly as it was done there, which means Aaron slaughtered it then, Cohen has to slaughter it in the future, then you could say the same thing by Paraduma. It also says Elazar and Chukah. So it should be only in the hands of a Cohen. So what is the answer? Shanehatam dichtiv. Now, the strange words that we saw before, Vishachat ota lefanav. It says they bring the parah to Elazar, he brings it outside, and he slaughters it in front of him. Now, it sounds like there's two people. One slaughters, one it's done in front of him. So which one refers to Elazar, we don't know. So comes Shmuel and he says, Shachat ota lefaneh means sheheh zar shochet ve'elazar ro'eh. Elazar just has to see the shchita. He doesn't have to do it himself because he's the lifanav. Lifanav means in front of him. In front of him must be Elazar. So it must mean that someone else is doing the slaughtering. So that's how he reads it, and therefore he proves from the pasuk, even though it's Elazar v'chukah, doesn't matter because it never told you in the Torah that Elazar is the one who slaughters. That's how he reads it. Obviously, Rav is going to read it differently. So Rav is going to say, Rav, how does he understand that pasuk? V'shachat oto lefanav. Rav is going to say both people refer to Elazar. Shachat ota lefanav means he, Elazar, slaughters it in front of himself. Now, what? Obviously, it's in front of himself. So what could that be coming to teach you? He says it comes to teach you a whole different law, which is Heseh chadat. Heseh chadat means you can't take your mind off of it because we want to make sure it never becomes impure, that someone impure doesn't come and touch it or come in contact with it. But they were very, very careful with the purity of the paraduma. So he cannot take his mind off of it. That's what it means, lifanav. Lifanav means it always has to be in front of him. He has to be thinking about it throughout the entire process. So now they say, okay, well, if you're going to say shachat is Elazar and lefanav means he can't take his mind off of it, and that's how Rav learns it. Shmuel obviously doesn't learn it that way because he says someone else slaughters it in front of Elazar. So where do you learn Heseh chadat from? Shmuel shelo yasiach dato minale. Where does he get it from? Nafkale mi v'saraf et hapara le'enav. Later on in the section it says, and you burn the parah in front of him, le'enav, in front of his eyes. That's where it means Elazar has to burn it in front of his own eyes, meaning he can't take his mind off of it. So now we're going to go back to Rav and say, well, Rav, if you learn Heseh chadat from the burning, why did you need to mention it by the slaughtering? To which the Gemara is going to say, Rav chad b'shchita v'chad b'sreifa. You need it in both places. Why? Utzricha, and it's necessary. De'i kata rachmana b'shchita. You might have thought if the Torah told you and didn't say it later by the burning, you might have thought maybe you only need it when you're starting the process. It's very important. You don't have to say chadad in the beginning. But sreifa is already at the end. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Sreifa, and that's why you need both. So then why don't you just have it at the end? Then you'll know you need it from start to finish. They might say no. Maybe this is the most important part because this is when the parah becomes, right, what you burn it to get the ashes. The ashes are what's important to us. The slaughtering isn't important. It's when you get the ashes. Maybe only then, because of its significance, that's when you need not to have heseh chadat. You have to be sure to have your mind on it. But maybe in the shchita process, it doesn't really matter. And therefore, according to Rav, you need it in both places. And obviously, Shmuel would say you don't need it in both places. And that's why you only have one, and the other one comes to teach you. Someone else slaughters it in front of Elazar, which is to teach you that a paraduma is kshera b'zav. Now they're going to say, assuming we take Rav, that during the shchita and during the sreifa, you can't have heseh chadat. That seems to imply, the Torah says it in two places. This is like we've seen before, shnei ktuvim aba'im ke'echad ein melamdim. When you have two laws that are said in the same law is said in two different places, it means just here, not anywhere else. So now they're going to say, if that's the case, limi'utei mai. What is it trying to exclude? What is it trying to say that in this case, right, you don't have to worry about heseh chadat in other parts of the process? Mai. Maybe it's to say, shchita through sreifa. After sreifa, what happens? Okay, I'll read you the pasuk. Va'asaf ish tahor, a pure person comes and gathers et efer ha'para. He gathers the ashes from the para. V'iniach michutz lamachaneh b'makom tahor, and he puts them down in a holy place, a pure place. V'aital adap b'nei Yisrael l'mishmeret l'mei nidach chatati. Now, it doesn't exactly say this, but the assumption is right. It's for meinida, for this purified water, which means you pour the water on top of the ashes and you now have it. Now, maybe you think that at that point in the process, he doesn't have to worry about watching it anymore and not having this hesech hadat, lapse of attention. So what do they say? You can't say that because what does the pasuk say? Limishmeret lemeinidakti. If I just read you, it's for preserving this meinida. Preserving, whenever it says mishmeret, like shmura matzah, or right, it needs to be limishmeret, needs to be watched, which means watching means you can't have a sechadat. So you can't say it's excluding the later process. So therefore, it must be that when you throw in the part into the fire and you throw in the cedar wood and the hyssop and the branch and the red strip of wool, when you throw that into the para, you don't need to worry about hesech hadat for that, because that's not an essential part of the para aduma. It doesn't have to do with the para, it's something external. That's the part where you don't need to worry about hesech hadat. Now, that was an aside that we got into because of Rav's proof for his position, right? Because we said, where does Rav get it from? And from there, he had to explain a pasuk differently than Shmuel. Shmuel explained it one way. He had to explain it comes to teach you about hesech hadat. Now we're back to our top, itma. Another machloket amorim about the same thing, except here we're just focusing on the para aduma. We're not talking about the para Yom Kippurim anymore. Shchitat para bezal, Rabbi Ami amar kshera, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha amar psula. So the shchitat para bezar, can you do it or can't you do it? Again, machloket between Rabbi Ami, who said azar can do the shchita of a para aduma, and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, who said no, he can't. Okay, so Rabbi Ami, who says that kshera holds like Shmuel, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha holds like Rav. Ula amar kshera v'amrela psula. Ula, we don't really know. Ula, some people said he thought it was okay. Some people said he thought it wasn't okay. Mativ Rabbi Yoshua bar Abba l'siyua l'Rav. Rabbi Yoshua bar Abba asks a question on Shmuel, which becomes a support for Rav. Okay, it'll take us a little while till we get there, so just remember, because we'll get back to it, that this whole thing is brought as a proof for Rav against Shmuel. So again, Rav says Azar can't do it. So it's going to indicate that Azar can't do Shlita. Now you'll see it doesn't really talk about that. So we'll have to explain at the end, how is this actually a difficulty on Shmuel? But we'll get to that at the end. So here starts the source. We know about sprinkling the waters. Okay, a woman is not allowed to sprinkle the waters because it uses the lashon. We'll see later. They learn it because it says Elazar has to do it, that it's a man, not a woman. And it has to be done during the day because it says in the pasuk bayom. Okay, it says bayom hashlishi. They don't quote the pasuk here, but it says, and he does it bayom hashlishi, and it says maybe Rashi quotes it. No, right. It's just because it says Elazar or the Kohen, and then it says he does it on Yom HaShlishi and Yom HaShvi. So Yom means day. So that's clear. But minayin l'rabot shchitata v'kabalat ama v'haza'at ama u'shrifata v'ashlachat etz erez ve'ezel v'shni tolad. How do we know that all the other parts of the process, or this list, not all of them, we'll see which ones, that slaughtering it, accepting the blood, sprinkling the blood, again, not on the altar, this is toward the Heichal while he's standing on Mount of Olives, and the burning of it, which he does there also, and throwing in the Eitz Erez Ezel V'Shni Tolat. How do you know that those also have to be done during the day? Talmud Lomar, Torah. This is like we saw the drasha the other day. Torah comes to include and say everything's the same, right? So where's Torah there? Zot Chukat Torah. The beginning verse says, this is the law of the Torah. So Torah comes to say things are the same, right? So even though it only says it by sprinkling, that it has to be done during the day, they assume these other parts of the process also have to be done during the day only. But now we're going to distinguish between those parts of the process and other parts of the process. Maybe also gathering the ashes and pouring the mayim, the water on top of it into the kli sharet, that's the kiddush, sanctification of it into the sanctified vessel. Maybe you would think that also must be done during the day. Talmud Lomar zot. Just like we had, I think it was yesterday, I don't even remember which day, but it was yesterday, thank you, that Torah comes to include, Zot comes to exclude. So Torah is going to include the processes we mentioned, the shchita, the sprinkling the blood, the burning of it, the throwing in the eitz eres ezov and all that. But Zot comes to exclude the gathering of the ashes and the pouring the water on top of it. Those don't have to be done during the day, to which the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question. Why those, yes, made it into the list and those are out of the list, right? It sounds very random. Once we had this riboy, which is Torah, and then we had the mi'ut, which is zot, right? We had the word that includes, and then the word that excludes. So let's go back to the beginning. Where did this all derive from? The sprinkling of the blood. Now they're going to say, the woman part is going to be the central part. When it comes to sprinkling the blood, sprinkling the water on the impure person, the end of the process, which is once you have the paraduma waters prepared, then you sprinkle it to purify someone. That's only a man can do it and not a woman. So, and that they take as a given. We'll see why later, because it says Elazar did it. So if Elazar did it, it must be a man and not a woman. And because it says there bayom, it's only in the day. So now what's going to be added to the list that can only be done during the day? Whatever else can only be done by a man and not a woman. So what are we going to have? What things can only be done by a man and not a woman? Shchitata, kabbalatama, the slaughtering, the accepting of the blood, all the things that said Elazar does it, those are all women and not men. So shchita, kabbalatama, haza'atama, the sprinkling of the blood toward the hechal, usrefata, and the burning, and ashlachat eitz eres ve'ezov u'shni tolat. All those have to be done by a man. Therefore, we're going to assume those are the ones that can only be done during the day. Since a woman can't do them, also, right, because our whole thing started with haza'ah, which can only be done by a man and only during the day. So anything else that only can be done by a man also is only kasher during the day. Seems that those can be done by a woman. There it just said v'asaf ish tahor. Now it does say ish. Often they say ish v'lo isha, but ish can also include a woman, and it doesn't say Elazar. So therefore, they assume even a woman can do it. Therefore, ksherim nami b'yom u'balayla, and therefore they can also be done at night. Once a woman can do it, they assume this is already on a different level, right? If we're gonna have to come up with something. We'll say, okay, a woman can do it, and it can be done at night. Okay, right. I'm not going to get into the whole women's issue here. I don't think it's, some topics that are more critical that you want to feel like, why are women excluded from this? It's a process that's almost similar to something done in the temple, right? It's done outside the temple, but it's parallel to something done in the temple. And maybe because of that, the women have to be excluded from. Now they say this was all brought, if you remember why, this was all brought because of a question against Shmuel, who said that shchita is kshera b'zar. A zar can do the shchita. Now this didn't say anything about a zar. So the Gemara says, "V'hai mai tiyuvta." Why did you bring this as a question on Shmuel? If you want to say because the woman can't do it, so maybe the zar can't do it, that's not going to fly because but the sprinkling of the waters can only be done by a man, and that can be done by a non-Kohen. So those two don't go together. So how are you bringing this as a question on Shmuel? It doesn't say anything about it. So Amar Abaye, Hainu Tiyuvte. This was the question. Isha my taima, Elazar velo Isha, Zar nami. It's going to be a little bit play on words. Elazar velo Zal. Okay, sounds kind of funny. Elazar Zal. But what did they say here? Since it says Elazar, it must mean Elazar, not a woman, by the shchita. Remember, this is assuming you read Shachat Otal Lefanav is Elazar did the shchita. Right? It almost ignores the fact that Shmuel himself read it differently. But right now they're saying it sounds like since it says Elazar by the shchita, and it means Elazar and not a woman, that's why a woman can't do shchita. So it would be the exact same logic for a zar. Since a zar is not Elazar is a Kohen and not a non-Kohen. So therefore, it must exclude a zar from shchita also. And therefore, they say this is a question for Shmuel, and they don't actually answer it. Even though theoretically they could answer it by saying Shmuel doesn't think that the shchita was done by Elazar. He thinks it was done by someone else. So it's a little bit strange why the Gemara doesn't answer. Last section for today, and this starts a whole slew of drashot that we're going to see also going into tomorrow. Ula is going to darshan the whole section of Para Aduma. So Amar Ula, Kol parasha kula mashma motzim yab mashma umashma mimel. This is a bit of a difficult line to understand. But what it seems to say is like this. Some people say, I'm going to just kind of add a little intro, which I saw a commentary say, which is that usually in a section of the Torah, it's all darshaned in a similar type of method. In this section, we're going to use two different methodologies for drashot, some psukim in one way, some in another way. Now, what were we just discussing? That we make a split between some of the activities. Some of the activities we understand have to be done just by a kohen or have to be done during the day, right? Other parts of the process are done differently. So what they're going to say is like this. Mashma motzi miyab mashma means that some of the verses, it states something and then immediately jumps to something else, which is not like the previous. That what's true for this pasuk is not going to be true for the next pasuk. And some of them are mashma mimele, that from one you can infer for all the others that some concept that's discussed here is going to be applicable also in the others. Now, the first drasha we're going to see today, some people connected to these concepts, but I found it very difficult. And I'm not sure that they need to be connected to these concepts. And I think more that we're going to see in tomorrow's daf drashot that clearly go with one or the other. And here it's just Ula darshing the whole section. And I'm not so sure that these first ones have to connect with this concept, because if you think so, you're going to have to kind of broaden exactly what it means and not exactly as it seems to be understood. So I would ignore, like we're kind of moving off of that rule right now, those two ways of darshaning. We'll get back to it tomorrow. We'll see some fall into one category, some fall into the other. And in the meantime, we're going to learn the first two drashot. So the first drasha is V'natatem otal elazar kohen. This was the verse we saw before from the very beginning of the section, pasuk gimel. They give the para to Aharon, to Elazar kohen. Otal elazar v'lo ledorot elazar. It says ota. This one you're going to give to Elazar. What does that mean? It means now it was given to the skan, the second in command. But in future generations, it doesn't have to go to the skan. Only in the desert did it go to the skan, but not in the future. Ika da amre, some people say, now, if it doesn't go to the skan, who does it go to? So there's two options. You could go up or you could go down. You could say it has to go to the kohen gadol, or you could say it can go even to a kohen hedyot, a regular kohen. So some people say lidorot b'kohen gadol. For future generations, it always goes to the kohen gadol. It goes up a level. Ika da amre, lidorot b'kohen hedyot. And some people say, no, any kohen can do it. So Bishlam Alamanda Amar Ledorot b'kohen hedyot. Shapir. If you say it goes to a regular kohen, that makes a lot of sense. Ela Lamanda Amar Ledorot b'kohen gadol menale. But where do you get it that it has to jump up a level? And if Elazar wasn't the kohen gadol and he was able to do it in the desert, so clearly it doesn't have to be done by the kohen gadol. But if you say has to be done by the kohen gadol, where do you get that from? So they say menale gamar chuka chuka miyom kippurim. We learn it from Gzeira Shava. Same word appears here, chukata Torah. And chukah appears, as we've seen before, in Yom Kippur. We make a Gzeira Shava, and we learn from one to the other. But just like there, it was done by the Kohen Gadol. Also here in the future generations, it was always done by the Kohen Gadol, by the high priest. Okay, some people say, Rashi says, well, what does the other opinion say? They just don't have this Gzeira Shava. The Ritva explains it differently. The Ritva says they agree there is a Gzeira Shava, they just don't learn this halacha from that Gzeira Shava. They learn other halachot from the Gzeira Shava, which is an interesting machloket. Do they just disagree about the Gzeira Shava, or do they agree but disagree with how to use the Gzeira Shava? Next drasha, vehotzi ota. Before we start, I'll give you an example. You want to get your little kid out the door. Often the kids don't want to leave the house, right? To get them moving is always hard. Transitions, so it's like the most complicated thing. So you want to get your kid out the door. There's two ways you could do it, two different possibilities. One I would say is less preferable, one is better. One is to grab your child and pull him outside, right? Not the best way to do it. One is to take a different kid, an older kid you have in the house, and say, why don't you come outside with us? And the kid will follow the other kid, right? Because they like to go where the other kids are going. Definitely works in my house. So now they say, v'hotziota, you have to take the para out. Now, what's the problem? You can't, with an animal, you'd say, oh, just pull the animal. People don't usually care. I mean, there are people right nowadays who'd be much more sensitive and say, don't pull an animal. But the Torah says you can't work this paraduma. Now, pulling an animal is considered work. So you can't pull the animal out. So what's the best option? Take another animal and have it walk out, and then the para will follow. Because how else are you going to get the animal out? Well, because it says hotzi ota, again, ota is limiting. Just like we had a minute ago, netatem ota, just this one, not in future generations, goes to the skan. Also, otzi ota teaches you shelo yotzi acheret ima, No other animal can go out with the para aduma. You can't use that tactic. So now you're stuck on how you get the para out, right? You have to come up with some other way. Keditnan, lo hayta para rotza latzet, as it says in the Mishnah, if the para didn't want to go out, ein motziim ima shchora, you can't take a black cow out with it. Shelo yomru shchora shachato. We don't want people to think, this is where we get into marit ayin. If two parot start walking out together, people will say, oh, maybe they didn't do the red one, maybe they did the black one. You can't take another red one. Shelo yomru shtayim shachato. We don't want people to think that they slaughtered two of them. Okay, Rashi says, okay, in other words, you can't do anything else while you're doing that, so you can't slaughter another one with it. You can only slaughter one at a time. We don't want people to think you slaughtered both. So you're stuck. You can't do both. Right? You can't do either. Rebbe Omer, lo min Hashem uzeh, that's not the reason. It's not because we're worried what people will think. No, it's just as simply, ela mishum shenema ota levada. It says ota. It means just that. It's what we call gzerat katuv. That's what it says in the Torah. So to which the Gemara says, "V'tanakama aksiv ota." And the Tanakama who had this whole reason. It's because we don't want people to think, blah blah blah. It simply says it in the Torah. Why isn't that good enough? So they say, well, man Tanakama Rabbi Shimon. Now we get something very interesting. Did Darish Tame Dekha? Rabbi Shimon was known. Yes, it says it in the Torah, ota, and that's really why. But Rabbi Shimon liked to give a reason. He says, why? Right? People understand things better when they have a reason. He said, why does it have to go out alone? Yes, it has to go out alone because it says ota, it has to go. But I'm going to tell you the reason why this is. To which the Gemara says, my benayu. What's the difference between them? Really, they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying you learn it from ota. It's just that Rabbi Shimon gives a reason as to why. So what's the difference? Well, ika benayu to afik chamor bahadeh. You take, right, let's say my example, you take someone else's kid, right? You take a donkey instead of a cow. If you take a donkey, no one's going to think you slaughtered the donkey with the cow. That for sure not. So Rabbi Shimon, who darshans the reason, will come to the conclusion, and this is always the danger of darshaning a reason. Maybe it really is forbidden. So if, right, and that's always the danger. How does Rabbi Shimon know that's the real reason? But if he believes that's the reason, then if you bring out a donkey to get the para going, that's no problem because no one's going to be concerned about that. But if your Rebbe has to go out on its own, just because it says so in the Torah and not for any reason or any known reason, then you would not be able to take the chamor, the donkey, out with it. So it's interesting, this goes to a big debate about, are you allowed to darshan Tamei Dekra at all? Because you could come to conclusions that maybe you're wrong, right? Maybe you're wrong about your reason. And then there are halachic ramifications of that activity. With that, we'll finish for today. Food for thought. Have a Shabbat tov.